Krishna states in the Gita, "However one approaches me, I approach them in the same way, for everyone follows my path in all respects." At the heart of Hinduism is the idea that life and God will reflect our intentions. All things are possible, but what we receive is entirely dependent on what we sincerely wish to attain. Not everybody is at the same stage of evolution, so naturally our religious goals and how we approach God will vary dramatically. Our inherent nature makes us see the world in a particular way. This dictates the goal of our existence. The goal then creates a narrative philosophy which guides the seeking mind. This eventually leads to an established tradition. It is the different teachers and divine masters who have organized these traditions. They have embodied the philosophy and inspired others to reach the same goal. In this video, we'll be explaining some of these different philosophies within Hinduism and showing how they are a response to the inherent natures within humanity. Broadly speaking, these can be outlined as follows. The pursuit of pleasure and enjoyment leads to a philosophy of religious materialism known as the Mimamsa. The perception of life as suffering leads to Buddhism, where creation is seen as emptiness. The desire to find our true self leads to Advaitha Vedanta, and the longing for ultimate meaning gives birth to a philosophy of love encapsulated in the Bhakti traditions. The Mimamsa school is a strong Vedic tradition which maintains that our purpose is to live in accordance with the rules and regulations of the Karmakanda scriptures. Rather than contemplating and going within, they argue life is all about performing ritual in a precise and proper manner. There is no inner state to be reached and no need for self-development. There is no one all-powerful God that exists, and even the various gods of the Vedas do not need to be pleased with worship. One simply needs to invoke their names during the procedure and the yajna sacrifice will bear fruit. Acharyas such as Kumarila Bhatta taught that ritual is like a machine. If we use it in the right way, it gives the right results, regardless of our inner state. At the heart of it, the Mimamsa philosophy sees the goal of life in a very simple way. We are here to live in accordance with the duties outlined in the Vedas, and by honouring this way of life, we can fulfill our desires and attain heavenly delights. Today in Hinduism, the Mimamsa school has largely disappeared, but the underlying premise of using religion to enjoy material success has not. The Vedic yajna has been replaced with other rituals and forms of sacrifice, where different deities are worshipped for worldly desires. But around 500 BC, the Buddha radically rejected a life centered around mere ritual and the fulfillment of desire. The famous turning point came when having a tour of his kingdom. Having been shielded from the miseries of life from birth, he saw for the first time a man who was sick, another who was old, and one who had just died. In an instant, he came to the conclusion that life itself was suffering. No matter what we have or what we have achieved, nothing lasts. Whereas the Mimamsa school runs after pleasure, Buddhist philosophy sees pleasure because of its temporary nature as just another form of pain. Because everything is constantly changing, attempting to cling to an existence which is forever on the move is what brings misery, and the goal of the Buddha was to find a way out of this conundrum. According to the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, because everything is changing, nothing has any essence or inherent nature. If we analyse things, everything we perceive relies on something else. In other words, there are only endless chains of causes and effects, an infinite net of interdependence, where nothing actually exists in and of itself. Even we as individuals do not exist, not even as the Atman or soul. Like parts make up a car, who we think we are is just a collection of multiple components brought together through cause and effect. There is no eternal self that passes from one body to another, but a causal link, a momentum that keeps these parts together life after life. When we strip everything down, in truth, there is only sunyata, or emptiness. This emptiness is not God, or some kind of realm, or anything at all. It is devoid of any existence. It is just emptiness. The Buddha advocated that it is not ritual but inward transformation through meditation which develops the right cognition. Then we can see the truth that there really is nothing there. Through this realization, the game of life defined by chasing desires ends, and with it the ceaseless suffering disappears. At the root of this philosophy, the Buddha was a pragmatist. He did not spend time discussing the nature of God. He had a profound sensitivity to the human difficulties of being alive. In Buddhist philosophy, sunyata or emptiness is an opportunity to finally end the turmoil of our existence. The philosophy of Advaita was chiefly promoted by Shankaracharya around the 8th century. He debated extensively with both the Mimamsa and the Buddhist schools. With the Mimamsa, he argued for the supremacy of knowing the self. Unlike the Buddha, however, Shankara stated that the Vedic ritual was a legitimate practice, but as one becomes spiritually advanced, it is knowledge, not ritual, that takes one to the final destination. The Vedic Upanishads declare the truth of who we are and what ultimately underpins this creation. Performing the ritual and achieving our desires is secondary to attaining the realization that we are the Atman or divine self. Advaita philosophy declares 3 principles. Brahma Satyam, Brahman is the only truth and there is nothing else that exists. Jagat Mithya, this creation with all its diversity is an illusion. And Jivo Brahmaiva Napara, the individual soul is none other than Brahman. In other words, the idea that you are an individual in a vast world is ultimately false. Just as when you wake up from a dream you realize it is an illusion, so too when you gain true knowledge you see that you are the totality of all that exists. You are Brahman, the supreme eternal reality. Many critics of Shankara have described him as an undercover Buddhist, and indeed the philosophies between the two are very similar. Both agreed that ritual cannot grant one freedom. They agreed that the material world brings suffering. They would also agree that it is the wrong perception of the world and our existence that makes us suffer. But whereas the Buddha stated that there was only emptiness, Shankara stated that there was only fullness. One might argue that there is no difference between the two, they are just different ways of looking at the same thing. Both sunyata and Brahman are unknowable to the mind and without qualities. They deny the world exists as we see it, and they both conclude that any sense of individuality is false. But at the same time, having emptiness as the goal is profoundly different to having fullness as the goal. Pursuing emptiness is to escape from existence, but striving for fullness is to attain truth. Whereas the Buddha sought to end suffering by denying anything exists, Shankara wanted to deny the material world so that we could reach for what is real. The emphasis on his philosophy was more on discovering who we truly are instead of simply ending the tragedy of life. Rather than negate the idea of our existence, he wanted us to see the profound depth of our existence. By meditating on the Upanishadic statements, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, Tattvamasi, you are that, Shankara declared that we can discover our true nature as the totality of everything, and this is the goal of life. Shankara's Advaita philosophy did not throw out the idea of devotion. The concept of a personal God with a form and the practice of worship was seen as a useful way by which we can fix the mind and raise our consciousness. But according to him, a personal God is not the final truth. It is still part of this illusory world. In the following centuries, however, great masters such as Ramanuja, Vallabhacharya and the Goswamis of Vrindavan put forward a number of similar philosophies which challenged this notion. They too rejected the idea that performing ritual to fulfill desires is the goal of life. They understood that material existence is suffering, but contrary to the Buddha, and like Shankara, they drew from the Vedic Upanishads and stated that it is not emptiness, but Brahman or fullness which underpins everything. But crucially, unlike Shankara, they argued that we as individuals are not the fullness itself, but an eternal, inseparable part of it. For the devotional masters, even though the world is constantly changing, it is not an illusion. Its material substance is real and is also another part of this fullness. Where Bhakti traditions radically differ from Advaita philosophy is that this fullness is recognized as a personal God. Whereas Shankara describes Brahman as formless and without qualities, Bhakti philosophy sees Brahman as a personality with a form and with infinite qualities. Whereas Shankara views devotion as a way to knowing the self, the Bhakti path views knowledge of the self as a stepping stone to real devotion. For these masters, the fruit of knowledge climaxes in divine love. Not love as an emotion, but a transcendent state that is unconditional and infinite in nature. Bhakti teaches that the purpose of life is not to fulfill desires, it is not simply to avoid suffering, and it is even more than discovering what is real. Our purpose is to fulfill a divine relationship with this fullness, with God Himself. This is what brings ultimate meaning and a solution to our existence. Love manifests not through believing we are everything, but through the humility of knowing we are part of something infinitely more than ourselves. Celebrating the glory of God does not come through denying the existence of the world as an illusion, it comes by understanding it to be an expression of Him. Krishna states in the Gita, "Know that all that is beautiful, opulent and glorious in creation springs from just a spark of my splendor." Creation is real because it is part of God. Divine love does not deny anything but affirms it and raises it to a sacred status. When it comes to suffering, Bhakti teaching agrees with the Buddha that it exists because of desire. But it goes further and states it is also because we believe we are the doer and enjoyer of this world. By surrendering our mind and understanding that God is the supreme enjoyer, we detach and transcend suffering. Because of this surrendered state, all rituals and action are performed not to fulfill desires, but as an offering to please the divine. In this way, all of life becomes an expression of love. The suffering which appears through attachment and desire is transformed into Leela or divine play, where everything is seen as God's will. The greatness of this philosophy is that it speaks to every aspect of the human condition. It gives us a narrative which raises us above the religious materialism of the Mimamsa school. It provides a solution to the suffering that the Buddha highlighted. It acknowledges our true spiritual state as the Atman which Shankara set out to do, but instead of negating the existence of the world, it affirms it as a partial manifestation of a personal God. In conclusion, Hinduism understands that each one of us is on a long cosmic journey over many lives, so naturally the human condition is incredibly diverse. We will look to religion for very different things. Each one is striving to reach for the transcendent in various ways, and the transcendent responds accordingly. The rishis and masters have therefore organised pathways for each of us to choose depending on our inherent nature. It is said, Yad bhavam tat bhavati, as is the feeling, so is the result. What makes Sanatana Dharma unique is that it boldly declares that however we are, God will manifest in whatever way we sincerely approach Him. Many thanks for listening.